Chaotic. That is the best way to describe the scene from the Joint Finance Appropriations Committee on Thursday morning. As the committee considered several key statewide budget decisions, 3 out of the 6 votes taken resulted in stalemates. The contention is over some of the most important aspects of the budget setting process. These include the revenue projection for the 2026 fiscal year, adjustments for personnel benefits, and the annual change in employee compensation. Now, despite the maintenance budgets passing in a vote this morning, the committee doesn't know what revenue to spend against and what the maintenance costs for staff will amount to. This debate illustrates how important these issues really are. After all, once this money is spent, it generally stays in the budget forever. So on this week's episode of Fiscal Fridays, we will break down the scene from JFAC yesterday and what it means for the cost of government this legislative session. So what happened in JFAC on Thursday? The committee entered the room poised to set numbers for what would make up the maintenance budget request. These numbers are essential for determining what kinds of cost of living, contract inflation, and cost-sharing adjustments are required to keep the lights on for another fiscal year. This is also the time where the committee votes to adopt a revenue number for the current and upcoming fiscal years. This allows policymakers to determine what they're spending against, so they don't spend beyond what taxpayers pay into the system. Things started to fall apart with the revenue projection decision for the 2026 fiscal year, being the one coming up in July. The governor recommended a pessimistic number of $6.26 billion, citing an impending recession. But the Economic Outlook and Revenue Assessment Committee felt the number should be higher, proposing revenues would reach $6.4 billion. There was also a third motion made of $6.33 billion to split the difference as a compromise. Both the compromise motion and the Economic Outlook Committee motions failed on the floor, resulting in a stalemate. There was a similar issue with the personnel benefits cost. The difference was between a $40.3 million figure and a $56.3 million increase. The governor recommended the higher of the two numbers, noting the importance of not under-budgeting for high medical claims. Others argued that the lower number was plenty, particularly since there is $80 million in reserve funding to account for expensive surprises. Finally, on the change in employee compensation, or CEC, the committee was faced with two proposals, one that would increase pay for all state employees by $1.55 per hour, provides a 5% increase for teachers, and an 8% increase for Idaho State Police, and an overall salary shift. The plan would cost $176.5 million. The alternative was a proposal that provides a 4% or $1.55 per hour increase for state employees, whichever is higher for each employee, an 8% increase for police, and a salary schedule shift. The teachers were excluded from this motion to be considered at a later date. This proposal supposedly cost around $88 million, but members of the committee recognized that there were several calculation errors in the motion. This required the committee to withdraw both motions and revisit the CEC decision altogether at a later time. But what is with all the fighting over numbers? For one, the revenue number is key for deciding how much spending is allowed in a fiscal year. Since Idaho is required to have a balanced budget, a lower number prevents the state from spending as much. Or the more likely scenario would be that the state would spend the same but offer less tax relief and wait until mid-year adjustments to rack up the bill if revenues were better than projected. Several conservatives were trying to prevent this latter scenario by voting for the larger number, stemming the growth of total spending. In the way of insurance, the question is really about whether the state should have large reserve fund balances. Though it could be nice to have a cushion, every dollar in reserves is another dollar taxpayers don't get back. The state shouldn't be storing funds beyond their obligation. Thus, the lower insurance number seemed prudent. Finally, on the CEC is not really about how much the increase is, but who gets the increase. If you give a $1.55 increase to each employee, it'll mean less to those who make more, and more to those who make less. But if you give a 4% increase to the top end and a dollar increase to the bottom end of the pay scale, you get a large increase for everyone in the extreme ends of the pay schedule. This latter option leads to increased costs for taxpayers across the board, and as budget writers proved today, it is exceedingly difficult to calculate. Meanwhile, the former option addresses the fact that those at the top of the pay scale are probably already making too much. So what does all this mean going into budget setting for the remainder of the legislative session? At present, it means that the maintenance budgets will go on before the revenue and CEC numbers are set. This doesn't create too much trouble for the time being, but can become a problem if it is not resolved by the time enhancement budgets are considered a week from today. Presently, conservatives need to demand two things. First, transparency in budgeting that incorporates the CEC numbers in the clearest way possible, even if that means delaying budget votes. Secondly, the lack of a revenue number shouldn't faze conservatives. Their goal should always be to keep the budget as low as possible, then send the rest to taxpayers. Doing this will prevent any overages. Lawmakers must keep in mind that these ongoing increases are added to the budget and rarely come back out. In essence, this is forever spending, and it needs to be done conservatively. In all, it was a very busy week in JFAC, and it is unclear how the committee will ultimately land on each of these decisions. We do know, however, that the establishment types aren't going to go down without a fight on even traditionally non-controversial budget issues. We wonder how this forecasts the budget setting process for the rest of the legislative session. But as we saw yesterday, conservatives are ready for it. Thank you for taking the time to watch this week's episode of Fiscal Fridays. To spread the Idaho Freedom Foundation's message of liberty, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Also, the legislative session is in full swing, so be sure to check out our website at idahofreedom.org to get the latest on the Freedom Index, votes, and noteworthy events.